Hi everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Daniel, and today, in fact, we'll be covering a game from the 2022 Philadelphia Open I played, and that also is the reason why we have a new background here, because I'm actually in a hotel room in Philadelphia as I just finished the Philadelphia Open, and in a couple of days I'll be playing in the World Open, so good luck to myself for that. So in this video we'll be covering my round 1 game from the Philadelphia Open, and so as it's an in-person tournament, my in-person rating is 1869 at the time of the game. So I was playing black, and let's take a look at what happened in the critical moment here. So here I had just played the move queen to c5. In fact, queen to d4 would have been better, attacking the b2 pawn, putting some pressure here, but nonetheless queen to c5, that's the move I played. Then my opponent played knight to d5. So knight to d5 is jumping into this nice outpost square supported by the e4 pawn. It's attacking the rook, and the idea is that I would most likely move the rook, at least from my opponent's perspective, and then afterwards they could play the move c7, for example, so that this pawn is no longer under fire because of this knight supporting it on d5. So after some long deliberation here, in fact after this move my opponent he went to the washroom, and then I spent around about 40 minutes here considering my move, and here I came up with the move queen takes c6. So queen takes c6 is actually an exchange sacrifice, as I'm letting my opponent take the rook on f4 with their knight. However, I had calculated the next couple of moves and found that my position was still okay. So my opponent, once he came back, he played knight takes f4, e takes f4, attacking the rook, and next move I'm about to take the pawn on b2. After rook to f3, I simply take the pawn on b2, rook to b1, and I drop my bishop back to this nice square on e5. So e5, this bishop on e5 is really nice, as it's supporting both of these pawns, so this pawn can't be captured unless he wants to sacrifice this piece back. And in the future I maybe have c3 to consolidate all of my pawns, and in fact it's kind of difficult for white to move. For example, this rook on b1, although it has an open file, it actually has no squares to move to. b2 is covered by my bishop, b3 is covered by the pawn, b4 same thing, and all of these squares are in fact covered, so this rook actually cannot go anywhere here. Let's look at the bishop. The bishop's controlled by the c4 pawn here, so it controls these two squares, and you can't really go to a4 right now unless you want to play rook to a3, which renders another piece really passive, and the only move that you actually have with the bishop currently is bishop to d1. Let's look at the rook. This rook, if it moves in an inopportune square, I can maybe play f3, having a discovered attack on the queen. And in fact, the rook itself actually doesn't have any productive moves. On the third rank, h3 is not really productive. g3 and e3 are both controlled. The rook can stay on f3 if it wants to. c3 is controlled, and unless it wants to go to a3, not much can be done with the rook. So here, my opponent, realizing that it was really difficult to move, decided to sacrifice back the material with rook takes f4. Here the computer suggests knight g7. In the game I played bishop takes f4. I also considered knight to g7, however I didn't really like it for some reason. I'm not too sure why. In fact, looking at it now, I don't really see much of a weakness. I think I was maybe considering queen f2 possibilities after knight to g7. Queen f2 potentially. Maybe setting up an infiltration here with the rook, and maybe setting up some rook f7 pins in the future, which could be slightly annoying. But here I could just simply take the rook. That's probably what I overlooked. I completely forgot that I could just win back the material. So in the game here, I played bishop takes f4, queen takes f4, and I play king to g7. So king to g7, so in the future I can move my knight, and also to make sure that even if the queen lands on f6, that there's no weak squares. Landing on f7 isn't a possibility either, since I just slid my king over to g7. Here my opponent, he plays the move, plays bishop to a4, and then I realized that, so my queen originally was on square c6, so here he's trying to distract my queen away from the 7th rank, basically. So for example, if I take the bishop, then there's simply rook to b7 check, and I would be mated shortly. For example, king to g8, then queen to f7, followed by queen to g7. I forgot the knight was covering this g7 square. King to h8, then there's queen to h7 checkmate. So I can't in fact take the bishop, as I would lose immediately with the rook to b7 idea. So I simply send the queen back to c7. So I consolidate all of my pawns. All three of these pawns are really nicely protected, and I also guard any infiltrations on the 7th. And you might also notice that my queen's on a dark square, so my opponent's bishop can actually attack it. So here he takes the knight, which is actually a blunder. I simply take back, and in this position I'm actually up a pawn. I'm actually up the c pawn, and the c pawn is actually passed. So in the future I could push it and maybe get a queen in the future. Here he gives queen to f6 check, which is actually another mistake, because simply after king to h7, there's no productive way of defending this pawn. Let's say they go back to queen to f4. Then firstly I have c3, simply trying to get my idea of promoting, or I can even play queen to e7, and there's no way of protecting this pawn. So here he realizes that, he plays king to d2 to avoid, after rook takes e4, that it's not a check. However, I still take anyway, it's a free pawn. And here I had also calculated what my opponent would play, which is rook to b8. So rook to b8 is actually a really tricky move. If I play queen takes b8, in fact it's actually a draw with perpetual check. So queen to f7, king to h8, and queen to f6 check. If I ever go to g8, then there's queen takes g6, and they can pick up the rook in the future. And I didn't like the prospect of this g5 pawn. So basically I have to go back to h7, h8, and they would simply just continue checking on the f7 and f6 squares. So instead, I calculated that after rook takes e4, that I can actually in fact play the move queen to g7 without giving away this d6 pawn. And that's also due to the fact that they played the move king to d2. If you take on d6, then I simply have rook to d4, and I fork the king and the rook, supported with my queen on g7. So here after queen to g7, I was also busy calculating whether queen takes g7, king takes g7, rook to b7. Although I knew this was winning, my king was forced to the back rank, and I'd have to calculate somewhat precisely in order to make sure that I don't end up in a draw by losing too many pawns. So after queen to g7, thankfully they dropped the queen back to f3, so not too many threats now. So I bring my queen into d4. There's not too many threats here, and the king has to move. King to c2, and simply here I drop my rook back to e7. Rook back to e7 to prevent maybe queen f7 in the future, since I don't always want my queen having to cover this g7 square, since the queen's a bit more of a powerful piece than the rook, so potentially I want the queen to support the c4 pawn to advance in the future. So here I put rook back to e2, rook back to e7. Computer here suggests simply just queen to d3 and just trading off the queens. However, I had to lose a pawn in this process, and also there's still the rook to b7 idea, which I didn't really want to calculate too much, so I didn't really want to go for this. Rook back to e7, and here my opponent pretty much ended the game immediately with the move queen to g3, which relinquishes defense of the e2 square. So simply rook to e2, the king is forced back to the back rank as there's no squares for it to go to. So king to c1, and here I simply play queen to d2, and my opponent resigns, as mate is soon to follow. King to b1, then simply queen to d1, and it's a ladder checkmate on the first and second rank. So, in fact, this game was pretty smooth. Found that really nice positional sacrifice with the move queen takes c6, realizing that this knight on d5 is in fact more valuable than this rook on f4, and also realizing and visualizing that my bishop on e5 would be a monster piece, as it would be supporting all of my pawns and making sure that there were no threats in the position. So yeah, in fact, this game was pretty smooth, and nice positional technique on my part, and yeah, hope you all enjoyed. But thanks for watching.